Hi there, this is Michael FLIERL, a visiting assistant professor at Ohio State University, and I'm here to talk today about an ECIL paper I've co-authored with colleagues from Purdue University, Clarence Maybe and Emily Bonham, to talk about initial findings from a new survey instrument we've developed for information literacy. And while that project is still in its infancy, the majority of this talk will actually talk about how such an instrument provides proof of concept for developing survey instruments related to new theoretical developments in information literacy that treats information literacy as context dependent and fluid. So here on this slide, you'll see some of our kind of guiding research questions. I think it's important first to note that this survey instrument takes place in a higher education environment. And so these questions also attempt to address important questions that are important in higher education. So for instance, what is sufficient evidence for administrators regarding the relationship for information literacy and learning? How do you provide evidence for such relationship at the scale of thousands of students across a variety of different disciplines? History is obviously very different from physics. And then lastly, how do you take into account new theoretical developments in information literacy that's happened over the last 10, 20, some odd years in the movement away from information literacy as something that's static to something that's more dynamic. So before we discuss results next, I wanted to very briefly discuss methods. Data were collected over 2 semesters. There was a short and long form version, so a 16 item or an 8 item. All of them were 7-point Likert scale. You'll see examples later on. And they were all based in, all the questions were created through a theoretical foundation of informed learning. That's the IL theory we were working with. And across about 8,000 students, we received a very respectable 42% response rate. So the initial results of the informed learning scale across those 2 semesters and across the long and the short version, we've found a small correlation between how students perceived their ability to use information to learn and course grades. So just to be clear, this is correlational. This is not validated yet. There would still be further statistical tests and examples to kind of provide further evidence of this correlation. Nonetheless, I think this still provides proof of concept, important proof of concept, that it is worth pursuing to investigate the relationship between how students use information or how they perceive themselves using information and course grades. So on this slide, you'll see there's a lot of information literacy scales. Here's a few that tend to be popular, but also many of these will use the now rescinded ECIL information literacy standards. And so that's a significant problem if we're presenting data in this higher education environment, utilizing or not utilizing new theoretical developments in information literacy, if we're simply using the old ones simply because it's convenient or it's been used previously, that elicits a number of problems, mostly in that the evidence that will come up to investigate, for instance, how librarians can contribute to student learning. Well, if it's based on an outmoded version of information literacy, that will not lend as much credence to that argument, and that's obviously problematic. There are, in a positive way, there are other more recent developments in information literacy that scales can use. That doesn't necessarily mean a movement away from standards, doesn't necessarily mean we cannot measure information literacy at scale. So the IL theory that we use is informed learning. As you can see on the slide, there's three core principles to informed learning. And I think it's most important to emphasize that informed learning focuses on learning first and then how people use information to learn. So in this higher ed context, it makes a lot of sense to use informed learning because the focus is already on student learning. If you're an academic librarian talking to an administrator, they're going to be concerned about GPA, course grade, things of that nature. How to teach students to use information is useful to them insofar as it helps student learning. And informed learning emphasizes quite vigorously student learning. It tries to build on learners' previous experiences of using information to learn. It promotes simultaneous learning about using information, learning to use information and learning disciplinary content. And it attempts to focus on enabling learners to experience using information and disciplinary content in new ways. And all three of these principles, learning plays a role. So therefore, in this higher ed context, it makes sense to use an IL theory that emphasizes student learning, that emphasizes something that administrators and other folks on campus already value and already know. It could serve as a link. They might not know information literacy, and that's totally fine, but most people on a student campus, instructors, administrators, etc., will care about student learning, will know about it. And so in using informed learning, we strategically decided to use this because, well, one, it's a rigorous information literacy theory, and two, it speaks the language of student learning. That's a language that a lot of people in higher education can at least understand. So it is a fair criticism, I think, of our project to say that you're trying to have it both ways, that you're trying to take an IL theory, informed learning, that is based off of learners, or that is concerned with learners' experiences, both of learning and their experiences of using information to learn in a specific context. And you're trying to reduce that experience down to a 7-point Likert scale from from agree to strongly disagree or something like that. In one sense, that's fair. In the other sense, again, we're in this higher education environment, and we have to navigate this tension between something that practically can measure information literacy across thousands of students, across multiple disciplines, and even within those disciplines, there might be sub-disciplines or areas of study that are entirely disparate. So we have that on the one hand. On the other hand, we have an IL theory that is focused on learners' experiences of using information in a disciplinary environment. So that is a tension that we've had to continuously navigate in developing this scale, and in anyone else moving forward, likely. That is a tension that would have to be kind of navigated in your own way. Nonetheless, we still think we struck some type of balance in which we've kept the core, the crux, perhaps the spirit of informed learning in the very minimum in the survey instrument, while also creating something that we can see at scale, broad trends concerning students' information use and their experiences with, and that, the relationship between that and student learning outcomes like course grades. It also helps, I think, that we've designed a short and long form versions of the scale. The short form is only 8 items. And so that survey instrument or others like it could be used in conjunction with already existing survey instruments. There's we've done some previous work combining IL instruments with the learning climate questionnaire that obviously tries to investigate students' learning climate, self-determination theory tools in which that attempts to measure student-centeredness and student motivation, There might already be things on campus being used that could be used in conjunction, and that might vary campus to campus. I guess overall, I think it's just important to note that there is a tension between IL theory and how informed learning treats the learning experience and treats using information versus the real need to provide actionable data to administrators, to academic librarians, to educators. So in this slide, you'll see some example statements from the informed learning scale. I'll do my best not to read off of them, but I'm hoping, the hope is that you can see how the questions, they've all been aligned with core principles of informed learning. And we're really trying to get at both students' experiences using information and their experiences using information while attempting to learn disciplinary content. So there's a number of different ways in which the informed learning scale or a scale using a different information literacy theory, but something comparable to it, there's a number of ways in which it could be used. It could be used longitudinally to track students throughout a curriculum over the course of semesters or years. It could be used in a pre-post fashion to determine if an educational intervention, like a one-shot might be too small, but something perhaps over the course of a couple different classroom sessions, we could determine if that's been effective or if students' perspectives on using information to learn in a context, did that change over time? You can also, again, like I previously said, tie it to other aspects of student learning, like motivation, like the learning environment, to try to suss out if certain activities or if a certain approach to teaching students to use information leads to a more student-centered learning environment. There is decades of educational research about the benefits, you can see in the Ryan and DC citation, the benefits to learning, to persistence, et cetera, in creating a more student-centered, motivating classroom environment. So one example that comes to mind is in citation management, right? There is a very prescriptive way in which to show students how to, cite scholarly articles in a scholarly appropriate way. You can simply tell them to do it or give them a guide, or you can, for instance, have a discussion about what this means, what conventions of attribution are for, what's the purpose, what's the end goal, and perhaps elicit discussion about that or open access or things like that, in which you can potentially get them a little bit more cognizant and intentional in how they're using information as kind of scholars within a specific field. And in that sense, potentially lead to them kind of owning it, I guess, where the locus of causality is more coming from them than from you, in which they're slightly more motivated because they understand it more. They've had an ability to discuss that more. So to briefly wrap up, more work is clearly required to validate and further show the utility of the informed learning scale. That much we know. What the purpose of this paper and this presentation is to show that it is feasible to utilize newer developments in information literacy theory that treat it as context dependent, that investigate the simultaneity of using information and learning disciplinary content, and then to investigate the relationship between students' experiences of using information in a disciplinary content and course grade as evidence of student learning. That's a mouthful. That's a really complicated way to say it is feasible to take new IL theory and to investigate, to use it at scale across disciplines, to investigate the relationship between information literacy and course grade, and treat information literacy in a sophisticated, nuanced, context-dependent way. Additionally, it's important to note that administrators need actionable data, that they need it at scale, and such an instrument, a survey instrument or something comparable to it, could communicate the value of academic libraries in furthering student learning and success across curricula. This could theoretically, if it's provided longitudinally within a course of study, there's a number of ways in which, partnered with other already existing and used and respected instruments on campus. There are ways in which academic librarians and educators can make a more forceful and stronger case for the relationship between students, how students are using information and how intentional they're doing so, and how we as academic librarians and information professionals can help students become more intentional and creative in using information, and outcomes that administrators and educators really care about, like course grade. So I think with that, on the next slide, you'll see brief references, and I think that'll be it. Thank you so much for your time. We very much look forward to hopefully a robust discussion about the scale, the instrument, but perhaps more broadly, how the field could better investigate the relationship between IL and student outcomes like course grade. So again, I'm Michael FLIERL. Thank you very much to my colleagues, Clarence Mabey and Emily Bonham. Without them, this project, this paper, and all the other scholarship associated with it would not be possible. And we very much look forward to discussing with you. Thank you for your time.